Welcome back everyone. For today's video, we are once again going to be returning to our educational speedrun series. So without further ado, let's jump right into the action with a classic rapid game of 10 minutes.
Zooming through the game with the bomb cloud start, trashing all your prep like it's modern art. Night on the rim, he'll still find the win. Chat's going wild, bro thinks he's Hikaru again. Oh hey hey, he's smurfing play by play, beats you blindfolded, still sipping latte. Queens are flying, eagles meet defeat. Just another speed run on Hikaru Street.
Alright, now I've been playing all sorts of openings. I don't think I've played C4 yet in the speedrun, so today we're going to start by playing this English opening. Now we get C4 E5, and here I'm going to play knight to C3. Now the English opening is something that is very tricky. It's probably not objectively a great opening in general, but what I'm going to advocate in terms of why you should play it is that if you play the Sicilian from the black side, this is effectively reversed. Now when you play the reverse Sicilian, it's very important that you either go for G3 or E3 very early in the game, as in this case my opponent is targeting the pawn on F2. Now I'm going to play E3, and the reason I'm going to do this is in our last video we covered the I believe the con or some of the E6 systems in the Sicilian. Now this is pretty flexible, by the way, the system with E3. I'll show you guys some other setups after the game. My opponent here makes a big mistake with G6. Now when your opponent does something unusual that you're not familiar with, especially as a beginner, you still don't want to stray too far from the basic principles. Now in the English opening, usually you can't memorize long sequences 20 moves out. So in this case, I'm just going to follow my general plan. Now what I'm going to play is knight to F3, and the reason I'm going to play this is, once again, I've developed these knights like in our previous video here, and my opponent cannot push the pawn as the knight captures, so the knight is on a good square targeting this pawn on E5. Additionally, I'm preparing to play D4 here. I'm going to get this big white center with these two pawns connected on the next turn if my opponent doesn't make a big mistake. So we get the move knight to C6. Now I'm going to play D4 here. The pawn, the knight, and the queen all guard. So you see when I take, I've got 1 2 guarding. He has 1 2 attacking, so 1 2 and 1 2, and I should be doing fine. Now my opponent here is actually doing very badly because he played this move G6, which really is illogical. It simply creates a weakness. If this bishop were going to go to G7, for example, you could transport it, this would be fine, but here black has simply created a big weakness on the king side. So now I'm just going to play standard chess. Black can take the knight on C3. I'm not really worried. I'll just recapture the pawn. So therefore I'm going to castle my king and finish the development on the king side. Now much like a lot of our other games, I have very free-flowing development here with the bishop and bringing the rook to the center of the board, even though we started this out with the move C4 on move 1. So we're waiting to see what my opponent chooses to do. I pretty much finished my development once again. Nothing is hanging, everything is guarded here. This is a very pleasant position for me, so we enter the middle game once again. Now as I said, I'll try to play the English in some of the other games in this video, but if we don't get it, or I should say even after this game, I'm going to try to explain some of the basic principles, because I do think the English is reasonable. It probably will catch some of your opponents off guard, because generally at the top level when you play the English, your opponent either plays the move E5 or they play something like E6 to go D5. I don't think most beginners are going to know what to do. So let's castle, finish the development, no threats, everything is guarded here. King's guards the pawns are safe. So now it's on my opponent to finish his development. Once again, you see he has 6 pieces on their original starting squares. So what I'm going to play here is I'm looking at this position. Now, again, with the lack of development here and the fact that I've finished castling to the king side, I really want to try to create threats on open files or diagonals. Now here, because of the pawns, I can't really attack on this long diagonal. So I'm going to go for the move rook to E1. Simple move, preparing to maybe move the bishop and check the king on E8. He goes for the move H5. Now, one of the ironies of this position is, even though the rook is on this file, if I move the bishop to D3 or F1, I check the king, but there's not a big threat. So once again, my opponent has pushed a pawn, still not developing any of these pieces. So the move that I'm actually going to play here is I'm going to play this move C5. And this is not necessarily a very common theme at the beginner level, but the main reason I'm playing C5 here is I want to create more squares for the bishop to move to attack the king on E8. We get the move D5, and now I'm going to play the move bishop to G5. Now the reason I'm going to go here, very simple move. The knight guards the bishop to attack the queen, and I always am free to move this bishop. Doesn't matter when, I can move the bishop at any time, but bishop G5 is a move which asks black the question of where the queen is going. We get queen to D7. Now I'm going to play the move bishop to B5, checking the king on E8. also potentially putting pressure with this pin of the knight on c6. My opponent here not developing his pieces. My opponent struggling to come up with a regular plan. Black is never going to finish development on the queen side here. The rook and the bishop are stuck on their original squares, so this is really dire already. Probably I'm just going to win the next couple of turns. The main thing, again, when you're a beginner and you're playing and you're out of the opening phase of development, is if your opponent is behind development, and more importantly, if the king is in the center and there aren't a bunch of pieces in front of the king, like here, you notice there's nothing in front of it. Trying to open up diagonals, attack on open files is probably the most important thing. Even pawn breaks to open up the center make a lot of sense. I'm not going to play the move c4 here. I'm going to play what I think most of you guys at home would play, which is move knight to e5, because if black takes a knight, you win the queen. So therefore this knight is actually forking everything. We get knight e5. I'll take the queen. My opponent still no development. 1 2. Okay, he takes with the bishop. 1 2 3 4 pieces. I take, and now the simple goal is with this great bishop on the dark squares, I should be able to checkmate the king. We get rook e8. Obviously, with an extra queen in the situation, I'm more than happy to trade the rooks. And now I'm going to go queen to e2, rook to e1, and try to checkmate on the open file. Again, heavy forces on the open file, always very powerful. So my opponent chooses to resign the game here. Now, this opening with the English, normally when you play c4, your opponent at the beginner level will play either e5 or e6. e6 is objectively completely fine. I don't think that many people will play this. It is possible if they prepared this classic Queen's Gambit decline structure. That I think we'll deal with another time, but what I'm going to focus on here is if black plays e5 and you go knight c3. Now, in one of my last videos, we spoke about the specific Sicilian opening with the move knight c6, d4 takes, and g6 with the accelerated dragon, or the move e6 followed by a6. Both are completely playable, but you'll notice here when you go c4 e5, this is actually a reverse Sicilian where white has an extra tempo. So after knight c3, let's say black were to play knight f6, I would probably recommend that you play e3 once again, and after d5 takes, either knight to f3 here, or this move pawn to a3. Knight to f3 sets up a nice trick, by the way. If black were to trade, you think e4, attacking the knight d4 and c5, and there are all these weak light squares around the king, but no. If your opponent plays e4, you have queen to a4, checking the king, and then no matter how black blocks, you take the pawn, and then you play d4, and you have this classic big white center. So after bishop c5, e3, g6, knight f3, again, simple point, black can't go e4, knight 6, d4, and already you're just going to develop the bishop, castle the king, and you've survived the opening phase, and you reach the middle game once again. So all right, let's go next game. So second game, let's get going. We once again have the white pieces. I'm going to play the English once again. It is kind of odd. All right, I said we were going to deal with this later on, so I guess we aren't going to deal with it. Let's go d4. So if your opponent plays this c4 e6 d4 d5, which is very likely if they play e6 on move 1, we'll face it head on. I didn't get to it in the analysis of the last game, so I'm simply going to figure out what to do. Now we get b6, very sag. We don't get d5. So my opponent wants to develop the bishop on the light squares. Now the move that I'm going to play here is knight to f3, simply developing. My opponent's probably going to go bishop b7, and now I'm going to play this move e3. Now, very similarly, I'm just looking to develop the bishop and then castle the king out of the center of the board. I could put the bishop on e2 here, by the way, but if I put the bishop on e2, you'll notice that there's no real scope on the diagonals. It's a very passive piece. The bishop on d3, even if it's not really a threat, you have more ideas of spying the pawn in this corner pocket down here on h7. So the square is a little bit better. Also down the road, you can potentially play knight c3 and e4 to build this big white center where the bishop supports the pawn thrust going forward. So I'm going to castle, very simple move, just keep it really standard. We get castles, and now I'm going to develop my knight to c3. Now when I develop the knight to c3, my idea is to play e4 here. I really want to push this pawn forward, take some more space, maybe go e5 and kick this knight back. This is already a very good position for me. Black probably should not have put the bishop on d6, should have played for d5. Nonetheless, we keep going. So we get the move c5. Now this is a move that I like here. What I'm going to play is something that I think fits with some of the themes here, which is that in a lot of these Queen's Indian systems where black fianchettos the bishop to b7, actually I'm not going to do it. I was going to play something more advanced. We're still at the beginner phase of this. I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to trade the pawn. And for anybody who's wondering, the move that I would have played in a serious game would have been the move pawn to d5, but I want to keep it simple. So I'm going to go e4. So now I have the knight and the bishop guarding the pawn. Knight, bishop guard the pawn on h2 is guarded, nothing is hanging. So now I want to figure out, how do I try to play towards this king? Now when I go e4, what I would love to do is go e5 to open up the scope again. My opponent plays knight to a6. This is actually a very good move. If I were to go e5, which looks very logical, to fork the bishop and the knight with the pawn, if I push, black can trade the bishop, and then after takes, bishop takes e5, black would be up a pawn. So I'm going to go rook e1, preparing e5, where after the exchange of the bishop for the knight, this rook is still going to guard the pawn on e5. We get knight to h5. Okay, it doesn't really threaten anything. I don't see anything under attack here, so I'm going to go e5 anyway. The rook guards the pawn in case black trades. The rook guards pawn. And the reason this move is so dangerous here now is that this knight on h5 is suddenly boxed out. You'll notice the knight can't jump to either of these two squares. The pawn covers this one, the bishop covers this one. So the knight is actually not in great shape here, stuck on the rim. But also I've now created this nice diagonal for my bishop towards the pawn on h7. So the move I'm going to play here is I want to think about this. Now, there are many ways to play this position for an advantage, but I'm going to try to follow a theme. Now, it doesn't mean that every position is the same. Every position is obviously different, but normally if you get a structure like this specifically where you've been able to push a pawn and kick a knight, it doesn't matter, it goes to e8 or g8 or somewhere, usually you're going to have a piece like a knight that can jump to e4, and this is a very effective idea because this knight potentially covers a lot of the dark squares, which are weak in this position. It's also worth pointing out, actually I'll point out afterwards, in the English you can get something similar. You get knight b4 attacking the bishop. Now I want to think about this. This is an even trade the knight for the bishop. Do I want to trade the knight for the bishop? Now objectively I don't want to allow this trade, and the reason I don't want to allow this trade is that when I go bishop b1, this bishop has great scope on the diagonal. I can move the knights at g5. There's all kinds of pressure, and also this knight on b4, there really are no threats here. Everything is guarded by the bishop, and so forth. We get f5. This, by the way, is an excellent move, maybe the only move in the position which I think I'm not going to be able to punish and win against immediately. Now the reason this move is so good is that if I move the knight away from e4, suddenly this diagonal opens up for the bishop, and if I take with the pawn with en passant, suddenly the knight jumps back into action. You'll notice here this knight, it cannot jump back into the action on h5. Both squares are covered, but after f5, if I take, now the knight is back in play. So I can move the knight away, but I think I'm actually going to take the pawn here. And the main reason I'm going to take the pawn here is because I still feel like with the knights on e4 and f3, I have a lot of space here in the center of the board to try and attack. Got bishop takes pawn, and now I'm going to play the move a3 here. I simply want to kick the knight away before it can do any damage on these three squares. Of course, nothing's under attack presently, but it makes sense that I want this knight to be further away from my forces. This is something you should be aware of as a general thing. This is already a little bit more intermediate of kicking pieces backwards. If they're getting close, like a knight on b4, d4, for example, say black could take a pawn and put it on f5. This would be nice to push a pawn to kick the knight. Vice versa, if this knight were to get to d4, for example, I'd love to have a pawn on like e3 or c3 to kick the knight backwards. But that being said, more often than not, this is going to be the most common situation, knight on either b4 or b5 for white or black, where you can kick it with a3 or an a6 move and the knight has to go. Same thing for g4, g5 as well, but a lot rarer. So we get knight c6. Now I'm going to go knight g5 here. I open up this diagonal. The queen attacks the knight, but also you'll notice that all my forces are starting to mass towards the black king side here. So at this point in the game, it's very hard to play. I would also point out the structures are really important. The structure where black gets these pawns on d7 and e6 versus say like a knight and a bishop on this diagonal. One of the openings that this is most likely to occur in is the Dutch. I don't think many beginners are going to play it, but I'll show you guys afterwards. And the general point behind me mentioning openings and these ideas is that when you look at it, we get h6, I'm going to take, is that even if the positions are different, the more you see the pawn structures, the piece play within the structures, the more likely you are to intuitively reason and make a better decision. Doesn't mean you're going to win games or play perfectly, but you're more likely to make a good decision. Now my opponent takes. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take with the knight here, because if black takes, there's going to be a big checkmate suddenly out of thin air. I could have also taken with the bishop as well. That would have been fine, but I'm lining up this classic checkmate idea on the h7 square. So he takes, and now this is a basic tactic theme. Probably you're not going to see it that frequently, but it is important to note. You go check, check, and mate. Many times you'll see a version of this where you move the bishop, to g6, you go queen h7 and take on f7. Now, a few things I want to point out. The first thing I want to point out is going to be about the structure. So one opening that you will see sometimes is this Dutch opening, where white takes, you got this, takes, knight f3, castles, and bishop d3. Little bit different than my game, but you'll notice here that you have the knights. Very oftentimes white will try to play h4, knight g5, and attack towards his pawn on h7. And when you look at the structure with the pawns on d7 and e6 and the knights and the bishop aiming towards the king side, this will be very similar to the game. Just to show you the actual position so you understand, when you look at this, a little bit different of course, but the same thing. The knights are here, the bishop is here. Black also has these pawns on d7 and e6 as well as the bishop on f6. Now the second thing that I want to point out is that knight f3 is not the only way to play this in the situation, but I just want to keep it very simple with development. Now, if black were to go bishop e7, castles, and knight c3 here, black could play d5, preventing me from pushing the pawn. And black also has ideas here to maybe even go c5, followed by something like knight c6, and black should be okay. But when you put this bishop on d6, this is just a very basic beginner blunder, because now you can never push the pawn. And generally speaking, you want your pawns in front of your pieces. Even in Fisher Random, which I played something like this is also not great, where the knight is in front of the pawn. So in general, just remember, you want to push the pawn forward and then put the bishop on d6. You don't want the situation where the bishop is in front of the pawn. You want the pawn forward, and then you have much more play. And there are a lot of general ideas that work as well. Now I'm trying to think, were there any other specific ideas I wanted to mention? Right off, I can't think of any, so let's move to the next game. Here we go. So we get black. So my opponent plays knight c3. Now what I'm going to play here is I'm just simply going to play the move d5. And the reason I'm going to play d5 is this move fits in very well with a lot of our openings. If we get the move e4, for example, you can play c6 going back into Caro-Kann. You could also take and play queen d5 going into Scandinavian. So if your opponent plays knight c3, I really like this d5 move. Now we get e3. So I'm simply going to develop my knight here. I'm not going to do anything super flashy. I think I'm going to go e6 again. We get bishop b5. That does nothing. I'll just block, kick the bishop back. Now, since my opponent actually has not claimed any of the center right away, this is something you want to keep in mind. If your opponent plays some of these like very weird slow moves, doesn't put anything on e4, d4, and doesn't have anything stopping the two pawns from going to d5 and e5, you almost always want to take the center if you have that opportunity. We get knight to f3, and now what I'm going to play is I'm going to go bishop to d6, simply guarding the pawn. Now the funny thing is, much like the previous game, we're getting a similar structure in that I'm getting this bishop behind the pawns where I can push this pawn and open up this long diagonal towards the pawn on h2. It's kind of funny how that works, actually, that we're getting these themes game after game. But my great hope from this series is that, at least in this early stage, when you see these moves happen, you see the same pawn structures, you'll start to understand where the pieces belong in general. Now, it doesn't mean you'll be able to execute some perfect attack to win a game or anything of that nature, but what it does mean is that generally you should have an idea of where to put the pieces at the start of the game. So I'm going to castle here. Now there's just a simple move, finish the development on the king side here. I do understand, of course, it's a little bit bright for anybody who's watching this video. I apologize. We got the move f3. I'm going to take here, no reason not to. I apologize, it's a little bit sunny. It is the afternoon here in Florida, so you do bear with me. We got queen f3, and now what I want to look at is I finished my kingside development. The knight's out, the bishop's out, the king's out. I've got a pretty stable center as well with these three pawns connecting. So what do I need to do? Well, I need to finish the rest of my development. Now I've got three pieces on the queen side that I need to bring into the action. If I go bishop g4, I actually lose a piece as the square is covered by the knight and the queen. If I go to f5, the queen takes it. So these two squares are gone. Now I could go to e6, which is reasonable, but one thing in general that I think about when I have bishops is the bishops are the one piece. Like, you can go to b4, you could also go to a3. Of course here a3 would hang, but you have many options with the bishop. So it's one of the pieces that I generally don't like to put on a fixed square early. I like to keep the options open as long as possible, and that's why I'm going to play the move knight b to d7. The reason for this is that after white trades the knight for the bishop, which I expect white to do in a second, the bishop will have more scope. I can still put the bishop on e6 later. I can still put it on g4, many different possibilities. So we get the capture. I recapture with the bishop. And as I was saying, here I can go bishop g4, I can go bishop e6, a lot of flexibility with this bishop. We get h3, reasonable move. And now I need to think about it. So I've pretty much finished my development here, pretty much. The queen and the rook aren't necessarily on the ideal squares, but everything else is done. So I've got a good center, everything's guarded, nothing's under attack. So I'm going to go queen e7 with the idea of rook a e8, and after that I will have finished the complete development of all my pieces here. Now my opponent, a little bit worse, primarily because he has what we call a backward pawn in chess. This pawn can't go forward, so it's a permanent weakness. I'll go rook e8, of course. My opponent also a little bit behind now in development. 4 pieces not developed, has not castled the king, one of the most important things to do at the beginner level. So we got the move g5. Now I need to be careful here. We need to look at the squares. h5, if I go to h5, the queen captures. If I go to g4, the pawn captures, which means there's only one other square to avoid losing this knight on f6, and that square is e4, which is where I'm going to move my knight. Now again, my opponent is pushing the pawns. He has not developed. You have 1 2 3 4 pieces on the original squares. This is definitely not what you're aiming for as a beginner. That's why I'm actually focusing so much on castling early, because once you get the king to safety, a lot of these ideas like pushing pawns simply don't do anything. Now if my opponent trades the knights, I actually would take with the pawn, and the reason I would take with the pawn and not the queen is that, again, look at this: rook, bishop, king, rook. These pieces are not developed, so my opponent is way behind in development, so there's no reason to try and trade off heavy pieces and go into an endgame. So we get h4. Now at this point there are already many ways for me to be much better, but again, remember, when your opponent's king is in the center and they're behind in development, where you have 4 pieces underdeveloped and all my pieces are finished, I castled, brought the rook, developed the bishops, everything, you're looking for open files, diagonals, or basically straight up tactics. Now I have the rook and the queen on this file. There's not a lot I can do, but what I can do is, I've got this check but doesn't do much. I can play f6, trying to force open a second file for both the rooks. Now if I can open the f file and the e file here, and this king is still in the center of the board, this is going to be a very unpleasant game for my opponent. Already I think this is very close to loss. If I were playing as a human, I would go g6, just ignoring everything just to keep this file closed. I don't expect my opponent to do that, but let's see what happens. So he goes a3. So I'm going to take the pawn here, and now my opponent is about to lose. The queen's under attack. I've got this open file. The rook and the queen are here. The bishops are active. Somehow, some way, there's going to be a checkmate pretty soon, I feel. Again, a3. This is why you need to remember the basics of developing pieces, because my opponent just has not remembered to develop these pieces, has not gone the king out of the middle. Even as early as here, or even as late as here, he could have gone bishop d2 and castles, also castles. Even here, castles or bishop to d2 and castles, but it's just way too late. We get queen g3, and now there are many different ways to win. I'm going to go for a pretty standard one. I'm going to go rook to f2, attacking the queen on e2 with the knight and the rook combining here. If queen takes, I will simply take the queen. Bishop g3 was also winning for anybody who is wondering why I didn't play it or keeping score at home, but rook f2 should be good enough. So now we get the move queen to d1, and again, many ways to finish the game, but I'm going to go for one of the more basic ones. Bishop g3 would probably be the best human move. I'm just going to go rook to f8. Now both rooks are on the open file. I'll take with the queen, attacking this rook. With the 2 rooks on the open file, white has 1 2 3 4 5 pieces on the original squares. This is not how you play chess. This is not what you want to do. You want to develop your pieces, get the king out of the center. Now of course you don't want to get cheese, which you guys have seen in the previous games, which is why I play e3, knight f3, castles right away. But if you don't develop, bad things happen. I think probably the biggest takeaway for me thus far in the speedrun series is the main tool I'm showing you is how to attack when your opponent doesn't develop. They get a little bit behind, and then you just open the files in the diagonals. This just loses the game. I take the rook, and it's simply queen takes f1, which is going to be checkmate here. Just not a very good game for my opponent. This one, there isn't a whole lot of tangible value. Main thing again is that in this position, my opponent here could have castled the king out of the center of the board. This would have made sense. Also bishop d2 and then castles queen side, but you have to finish your development. When my opponent starts pushing the pawn, you see nothing's developed. I go f6, I start to open up the files, and it turns into a complete disaster immediately. So I think that's going to do it for today's edition of the educational speedrun series. If you guys are not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with some fresh content very, very soon. Hope you guys enjoyed it. You learned something about attacking when your opponent doesn't develop pieces, and all's well that ends well. See you soon. Bye.